to it later. All right, so in the Nearpod code, the Nearpod lesson, in you go. And I'm sharing the screen. All right. All right, so the Nearpod lesson is RLNM8. All right, as before, the code will be up here in the top left-hand corner of the screen should you get lost. It's also posted in the classroom. All right, so just joining in, here we go, got you in there. Fantastic. All right, now we're going to be talking about this topic to start with. This is the idea of GDP. Now, as said, we're hinting at the idea that this is what we're going to be discussing, where economic growth is going to be one of our targets for the entire macroeconomy. All right? Now, GDP, as it's written here, stands for gross domestic product. Right? So gross isn't meaning, oh no, I don't like it. Right? Gross is actually going to be talking about a total. It's going to be an old-fashioned word for total. Right? So the total amount of product or production that we are manufacturing domestically, or if you like, within the economy. So that's a bit of an explainer as to why we use this sort of unusual phrase, gross domestic product. Quite often you'll see it written as just GDP. So here we go. Right, definition time. GDP is classified as the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. Market value. So therefore, if things are being manufactured or produced outside of a market, then they're not included. And that will have an impact. If there's a lot of activity in the economy that isn't going through a market, right, then there will be perhaps a smaller GDP than there could be. Right? So some things that don't go through a market might include, if people are voluntarily working for a company and not getting paid, or a business not getting paid. If people are staying at home and helping to raise children, they might not necessarily be being paid for that. It's not a job necessarily. So therefore, it isn't technically counted in GDP. Right? Why do we use this idea of GDP? Well, it's got to do with economic growth, principally. So we're going to use it as a measure of the size of your economy. So how big our economy is. Right? So the growth of our economy. So you remember back to the PPC diagram that we illustrated all the way back in year 10, and how that PPC model shifts out to the right. It grows, it expands, and that's the size of the economy, expanding. Right? And GDP, when the numbers of GDP get bigger, then that will be part of this idea of a measure of the size of our economy. We can also use GDP to compare different countries. So if we are wanting to compare Malaysia with Singapore, or if we're wanting to compare Malaysia with China, or if we're wanting to compare America with China, we can use GDP more or less to figure out which country is growing faster than which other country. We can also use it inside our economy and say, well, how is our economy growing over time? So how has Malaysia grown as an economy over time? Now, there was another word used in our definition that you may have missed. It's this one here, and it talks about final, right? All final goods and services. So we say final because we're talking about goods that are sold to the end user, the final user, right? Now, the reason why that's a problem is because if you imagine a pizza, right? A pizza is made up of a whole lot of ingredients, like the cheeses and the meats and the sauces, etc. But when we're counting the value of the pizza, we only want to count the value of the pizza as it's sold. Excuse me. Okay? We don't want to count the value of the pizza as it's sold plus the value of the cheese that's sold to the pizza company and the meat that's sold to the pizza company and the salt, yeah? Because otherwise you're in essence double counting. So if you count the value of the pizza when it gets sold to the consumer, that's the final good, then all of those ingredients are kind of accounted for within the value of the pizza itself. So that's why we talk about final, right? We want to also obviously discuss that GDP is inside your country. It's domestic inside your country. It's generally over the course of a year. Now, my battery level on my computer for some reason is getting a little bit low. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to swap, move where my computer is. So apologies if this causes you a bit of a, oh, we've moved, all right? And then it will be plugged in. But I'll give it another couple of seconds, and then I will move the computer. It won't cause too much problem. Now, so that's what GDP is all about. Now, here is a close exercise for you, and all you have to do in this particular exercise is fill in the gaps, just as before, right? Move the words into the place where you think they best belong. Right? I know it's a bit tricky with computers sometimes, with trackpads and the like, and it might be easier with an iPad, but have a go, see how you get on. And as you do that, I'll just move the computer over. So I apologize if the screen looks a bit awkward as I move it. Here. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so just filling in the gaps, got about 30 odd seconds to have a go at that. Good work, Sean, well done. Have a go, the rest of you. Good work, well done, team. Waiting on a couple more to have a go. About 30 odd seconds, and we will move on. So last call for last call. Right. Now this is what we were looking at here, right? This was our definition for GDP, the market value of all final goods and services produced in the country in a year, used as a measure of the size of the economy, and is used to compare different countries and also to monitor the progress, economic progress, the growth of the country over time. All right. Now, check this one out. A couple of things I want you to have a look at with regards to this. So these are statistics. This is the sort of thing that you might see in the exam. There's a chance of that with regards to your ability to analyze, because part of your skill that you're developing is that idea of data analysis, data identification and data analysis. And what does the economics of the data tell us? So if we have a look here, we see that we've got, these are all the countries down here. It is from 2011, so it's a bit old, right? And then it's the top 10 economies. So these are the biggest economies in the world with regards to what's called nominal GDP. We're going to come back to this idea about nominal in a minute. But if we just have a look at the data first off, right? So things that you can see that immediately stand out the page for you. Understandably, we'd see the US here as being very, very high up with regards to what's the #1 economy, right? and it's got the actual value here. So we can see that this is the thousands of billions, right? So this actually works out to be about 15 trillion. Okay, $15 trillion worth of nominal GDP is what we're kind of looking at there. And then if we have a look, here's China here. So that's, again, 2011 data. But China has, what, about $7.2 trillion worth. So if we just compare, if we do use this to compare these countries, we might make the suggestion that the US has effectively twice or nearly twice the value of GDP that China does in this context. You could go further down the list and you could make a comparison between, say, France and Brazil and say that their economies seem to be quite close, but Brazil and the UK even closer. And then further down the list again, and you'll see Russia and India and see that they're very close as well. Right? So that's the sort of analysis that you can do. You can talk about the size difference, you can talk about the actual numbers, right, and make those sort of comparisons with regards to them. In fact, if you wanted to, you could actually add up India, Russia, Italy, the UK, maybe Brazil as well. If you add all of those economies together, you're going to get pretty close to the USA's figure. So the USA is bigger than the 1, 2, 3, 4, at least the bottom 4 of these countries. Right? Now, the word nominal is used there. Now, there's a reason why we use the word nominal. Right? I'm just going to skip here to this bit, and we're going to come back to that word nominal in a minute. Now, if we have a look, this is a different way. This is the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, right? And they are representing here the world's GDP, right? With these countries in mind, right? Now, there is 188 countries here that aren't included, right? But these are the rest of those 10 biggest economies, basically, that we saw before. This data is from 2015, so it is still, again, old, and obviously you'd make some suggestions about what has happened since then. But which country is producing a fourth or a quarter of all of the world's goods and services? Right. Okay, so if we stop the sharing, we jump back to the meat. Right, which country of those countries seems to be producing a quarter of the world's entire GDP? Yeah. Well done, Abu. Yep. It's not us as such as it is the US, but yes. Yes. You're absolutely right. Well done, dude. Well done. Yeah, it's America. The American economy is so big, and we saw evidence of that in this one, right? It's sheer scale of that production, right, in comparison to the rest here. America is so big that it actually is producing a quarter of all of the world's goods and services, all by itself. Now, you're going to make an argument that China is going to be pretty up there as well. And then if you think about the percentage of the rest of the world, okay, right, then that's not going to be very much really at all for 188 countries. So let's have a look here. The USA, yes, so it's a quarter. So that remaining 188 countries, so this segment here is actually producing only a quarter of the entire world's GDP. And you can figure that out because this is the United States and they're producing a quarter. So if you were to imagine that remaining segment, it's the same size as the US. That means that these 7 countries here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yes, they produce 75% of all of the world's products. Now that's pretty staggering. And that's the sort of analysis that you can use this GDP number, GDP figure, for. Now, we've talked about this idea about nominal before. Back here, where is it here? Nominal. Now, are you familiar with a particular country? Let's stop the sharing. In fact, you are. One of the other macroeconomic problems that we discussed, well, in fact, we discussed a couple, right? We discussed a couple of really big macroeconomic problems last year, basically, last academic year, so before the summer. And we talked about there were two major case studies that we discussed, one of which was a country called Zimbabwe, and another of the countries was, I've forgotten now, Venezuela. What was the major macroeconomic problem that was impacted on both Zimbabwe and, what was the other country? Venezuela. Right? What was the major economic problem? Do we remember? Type it into the chat. Yes, well done, Ahmad. Absolutely, hyperinflation. Right? The inflation was so big there in both of those two countries that we saw the massive economic collapse, basically, of those countries. Now, over the summer, I managed to get this. Now, this is a replica. It's not a real one. The real one is much more expensive. But this, if I hold it up to here, you might see, right, is a replica of the banknotes that were in Zimbabwe at the time. And you might just be able to read it. It's in gold because it's a replica and it looks cool if it's in gold. But you might be able to read the note value there. This banknote, which was actually produced when it was a banknote in Zimbabwe, had the value of $100 trillion. $100 trillion. And look at the zeros, number of zeros there. All right, that's a lot of money. Right now, this obviously isn't worth anything because it's a replica, but even the actual banknotes, which had $100 trillion written on them, weren't actually worth $100 trillion. Right? Because of that situation of hyperinflation. So what that led to, as we discussed, was that led to a problem of figuring out how expensive things were. Right? Remember we talked about how they had to keep changing the prices on everything and everything's going up. And so how would you work out the real value of things? Right? Well, the only way to work out the real value of things would be to remove the inflation cost, to take inflation out of the picture. Right? And that's what they ended up doing, crossing out some of the zeros, basically, and removing inflation. So when you talk about numbers that are in economics that are real, what we say is that they have removed inflation. Right? So there is no inflation effect on those numbers. And particularly economies like the Zimbabwe's and the Venezuela's, that is an entirely very useful thing to do. So when we talk about nominal GDP, that's not real GDP, that's nominal GDP. So what that means is that inflation hasn't been taken out. So there is still inflation in that number. So this number is really big, but maybe the USA had a lot of inflation in 2011. I've got to say, no, it didn't. But, there's a chance of that, in which case this number actually might be much less in real terms than it appears here. Right? So that's something to consider as well. The difference between nominal and real. Real numbers for GDP have inflation taken out of them. Nominal GDP is just the GDP that you'd calculate, right? That market value idea. So no inflation removal. Right, what about this one? Check this one out. Canadians are a lot wealthier than Mexicans overall. Why does Canada not have a darker color, a different color on the map? Why does Australia not have a darker color than India? Why are Norway and Switzerland the light color? So this is this is 2014. So again, it's old data, but what they're doing here is they've got, again, nominal GDP, right? And the darker the color, they're suggesting is bigger, right? So the lighter the color means that there's less income with regards to GDP. So the countries that have the darkest color are the countries that have the most amount of GDP. That's what they're suggesting. And the lighter it goes, the smaller the amount of GDP generated by those particular countries. So these questions, again, if we have a look at Canada, and then you have a look at Mexico, why is it that Canada, which is a lot wealthier, not have a darker colour, right, when you look at the map? Right? So let's stop the sharing. Jump back to the meat. Why do you think that Canada and Mexico on that map appear, excuse me, appear to have basically the same level of nominal GDP? What is it that we're not taking into account? What do you think?
Inflation?
Or inflation is a good idea. Yes, we are taking inflation into account. Absolutely right. But there's something else as well that we're not taking into account. What might that be?